Okay, so for this video, let's look at some sort of more general properties of sine and cosine functions. In this video, we're going to focus on what we'll call the 5 key points. So if you are transforming these functions, what you should do is you should focus on these 5 key points. I know we focused on many more points than 5 in the above examples, but 5 is really all you'll need to focus on for transformations. So if we look at the typical sine function, we know that it starts on the center line. So for example, here we have the start of our sine function, and it starts along this middle line. And this middle line just happens to be the x-axis, or you could say the axis that tracks your angle, or your theta axis, whatever you want to call it. It's your horizontal axis. So for sine, it starts on the center line. What about cosine? Let's actually keep this color-coded. I think I made sine blue up here. So sine starts on the center line. What about cosine? Cosine doesn't start on the center line, does it? Cosine does not start on the center line. Cosine starts at its maximum. That's where it starts. That's where it begins. So cosine starts on the maximum value. And again, I'm failing at keeping this color-coded. This should be red. Cosine starts at the maximum value. Now, if we start to look at sine, well, let's say this is your y-axis, and this is your x-axis or theta axis, and let's say this is sine. Well, we know that it's going to actually increase. So it goes up to the maximum. Very common error is to start with your sine graph at the center line here, and this being your y-axis, and then going down and decreasing. But this would be an error. It is almost correct to draw your sine function like this, but you can see that this curve that goes down and then up, that's not quite the same curve as this sine function that initially goes up and then down. So sine goes up first to the maximum, not down. So this would be our first point, our centerline point, and our second point is after we've gone up to the maximum. What about our third point? Well, our third key point, would just be going back down to the center line. So it goes down to the center line after it hits the maximum value. After this, it just continues going down, and it decreases until it hits the fourth key point, which is goes down to the minimum. Then what else does sine do? Well, at the minimum, it changes direction. It starts to go up again. It starts to increase. So after that, after it hits the minimum, it goes up back to the center line. So that's the behavior of a typical sine function, and those would be the five key points, right? So the first key point is that it starts at the center line, and then it goes up to the maximum, then down to the center line, then down to the minimum, and then back up to the center line. What about cosine? Again, like we mentioned, cosine starts at a maximum value, so we could overlay a vertical y-axis here. So we could overlay a vertical y-axis here. This would be where it starts. This would be maybe what you would call the first key point. And then it immediately decreases, right? Of course it should, right? It should decrease away from the maximum. It shouldn't increase away from the maximum, because then that wouldn't be the maximum anymore. So after we start at the maximum, it goes down until we hit, what would we call this? This center line point. Until we hit the center line. And then this pattern continues decreasing until we hit the minimum. So it continues decreasing, it continues down to the minimum. That's what cosine does. And then cosine goes up. It changes direction, as it should after the minimum. So it goes up to the center line. And then after this, it continues increasing until it hits the maximum again. So it goes back up to the maximum. So these are the general patterns and key points for sine and cosine functions. So cosine starts at the maximum, decreases until we burst through the center line down to the minimum, and then it changes direction and starts increasing through the center line and then up towards the maximum. That's the behavior of cosine. And the behavior of sine, well, the first key point starts at the center line, and then we increase. We increase up until we hit the maximum, and then we change directions and decrease through the center line point until we hit the minimum, and then we start increasing after the minimum until we hit the center line point. And that would be one period of sine. So one period of sine has 5 key points, and one period of cosine has 5 key points. It's just that they start at different key points. Sine starts at the center line, cosine starts at the maximum value. So here we see some definitions here. A periodic function is just a function that repeats over and over at regular intervals or cycles of its domain, and a sinusoidal curve is just a curve that fluctuates or oscillates up and down like a sine graph or a cosine graph. So in red and in blue, you can see that they look pretty similar, and they are. They are both sinusoidal. Let's look at these 4 quadrants. Actually, let's wait for that for the next video. We'll break this up a bit.